And we are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about the new Omega Seamaster ceramic up against the Rolex Submariner ceramic, particularly the Hulk variety. Now, that's why I have these white gloves on. There's no other reason. And I just want to get behind the wheel, get behind the camera, and compare the Seamaster and the Hulk to show you that I think the Seamaster is kind of a better watch, but I don't want to ruin the rest of the video just yet. First, I'd like to thank you for sticking with me. If you're new to the channel, what we do is we talk about watches like the Hulk, like the Seamaster, and throw in some other things from the watch dealer's perspective, so please like and subscribe. I do appreciate that. And don't forget to check out delraywatch.com, where for you guys out there that will find this and leave in the comments below, yes, full disclosure, we do have this Omega Seamaster ceramic available at delraywatch.com, though the Hulk we do not. So unfortunately, it's in such high demand, we do not have that one. And of course, you can find me on Instagram, the real John P. So what we're going to do is I'm going to change the camera angle now. We're going to take the Hulk, we're going to compare it to the Seamaster, and we're going to go spec by spec, line by line, and compare the details before we get into my opinions on them. There's some videos out there that kind of do that, but they talk about one watch and they talk about the other watch, and I think that there's some points that really need to be driven home, and we're going to do that starting now. So here we are behind the lens with the Rolex Submariner ceramic Hulk, as well as the new ceramic Omega Seamaster. Now on the left, of course, we have we have the Rolex Hulk you all know and love, or will probably love, and on the right we do have the Seamaster. Now the first thing we'll notice is the case size. Of course, with any watch, we must consider the case size. With the Rolex Submariner, we have a 40mm by 47mm case size. Now with this Omega Seamaster, we have a 42 by 49mm case size. Now what this means is technically, by specs, the Seamaster is a little bit bigger than the Submariner, though it's interesting to note that they wear on the wrist very similarly because of the case size and profile rather. So the Submariner, sure, technically a little bit smaller of a watch, but it wears about the same. That's something to keep in mind. Next, the material of the case. The Rolex Submariner is stainless steel. It's produced with something that Rolex calls oyster steel, whereas the Seamaster is just produced in a hardened stainless steel. It's also interesting to note that some of the other materials and items that's in this Rolex Submariner, Rolex kind of just comes up with unique little names because they do change some of the elements inside of the material for what they claim to make it a little bit better or a little bit harder. They also do this with their precious metals like their gold and their Ever-Rose, and it's something that Rolex has just done very well with in terms of branding, whereas Omega is just starting to get into those types of things, and we'll talk about it when we talk about the ceramic that they use. Next, the case back on the Submariner features the typical oyster case, the oyster case back, and it's a screw-down case back. Now, with the Seamaster, what we have is actually a screw-down case back, but it's sapphire and it's see-through, so you can see that gorgeous Omega 8800 caliber coaxial movement. Now, that's kind of interesting because typically for true tool watches, brands will stay away from having sapphire casebacks because it requires a little bit more work to ensure the depth rating, but Omega is able to do so just fine, and in the year 2019, I suppose that's no longer an issue for a brand such as Omega. Moving on to the crown. Both of these watches have a screw-down crown. Omega has a feature called the triple lock, and Omega just has a screw-down crown. Now, I'm sure that they both perform about the same. Of course, we would have to actually submerge them and test the crowns, but nonetheless, it's screwed down. There's going to be proper gaskets and fittings, so there's nothing to worry about that, so they're very comparable in that regard. Now, moving on to the bezels with these two watches. The bezel in the Rolex Submariner is something called Cerachrome. Now that's one of the other little words that Rolex comes up with to just call the ceramic material that is used in their bezels. Now, I'm sure they've just changed a few elements to possibly make it a little bit harder, but nonetheless, they've created a brand around that specific material, and that's very interesting. Now, Omega just calls theirs ceramic, though you'll notice later in this comparison, you can see it actually on the dial. They have a ZR02, which is right under the center of the dial, right above coaxial, and it actually stands for zirconium oxide ceramic, which is the material on the dial, but it's likely something either very similar or it is in the bezel itself. Both are unidirectional, typical dive bezels, so nothing to report out of the ordinary there, but overall the ceramic really adds that kind of luster and sheen to both of these watches in my opinion, which I will throw in there. Now moving on to the movements. We have to talk about the movements because I think this is where Omega really starts to shine, especially considering the price points, which I'll talk about later. Rolex, in their Submariner, is using the 3135 Rolex movement with a 48-hour power reserve. Now, they tune this or regulate this to plus minus 2 seconds. Now, it is a chronometer, and it is a certified chronometer, this Submariner, but Rolex goes a little bit above and beyond and goes plus minus 2 is what they guarantee on their website for the timekeeping of this Rolex. Now, with the Omega movement, there's a little bit more to report back. We have the 8800 coaxial movement that's rated for 15,000 Gauss. So for a dive watch, that's actually pretty impressive. It has a silicon balanced spring, it's rhodium plated, and the finishing is beautiful. By the way, it's a 55-hour power reserve, and it actually lasts a little bit longer than that, but it's rated for 55. And if we just flip the back here, we can see how beautifully it's decorated. You can see the jewels, you can see all of the different finishing elements, you can see it ticking away. I think it's a gorgeous movement. In the 8800, to be put into a sports watch typically was reserved for some of their more higher end pieces. I think that's just a rock star, literally a movement, a rock star movement that Omega has pulled off on this one. Now this is tuned to -0 plus 5 seconds, so Omega, you can tell they really would rather you be a little bit early for the occasion than a little bit late, but I suppose if you're wearing a Rolex, being a little bit late for something is not your primary concern. Once again, I do wear Rolex, so this video is not to completely discredit what the brand has done. I do typically wear Rolex, but it's really shedding some light, literally, on this Omega here. So looking at the cases and the construction, you can see that the Omega has the helium escape valve right here. You can see there, it has the helium escape valve. Now this is something that Rolex has in some of their deep dive rated watches, such as the Deep Sea, but in terms of their Submariner, it does not feature that, so that's not something that's necessarily required for all levels of diving, though it's kind of a nice to have. And it should also be noted that the Seamaster has had the helium escape valve since the earliest generations of the watch within modern times, whereas the Submariner has just foregone that feature there. Here's kind of where it would be. It's not there, and they do have it in other models. So yes, both dive watches, but the Omega really kind of shines in terms of it being a proper, highly featured tool watch. So moving on to the dial. Now, the Rolex dial, it's a beautiful dial in my opinion. It might be hard to catch kind of the way that the green kind of changes a little bit in the sunlight, but if you were out in the sun, you'd see the darker and the brighter shades of green, and I think it's actually a pretty nice touch, though when you look at it in this light, it really does look a little bit bland in my opinion, though the surrounds are white gold, so the markers are white gold, so it does give it that little bit of an extra kind of luxury feeling, a little bit of a shimmer in the light. The white gold hits it just nice. Now, in comparison, the Omega Seamaster we're talking about here, the ceramic Seamaster, it actually features a special material that the dial is made of. Now, this is called the zirconium oxide, and it's a type of ceramic, and you can see that actually marked ZR02 right there in the center of the dial. And Omega really wants you to know that they've done something special with this dial. So parts of this dial are actually made of ceramic. Now, the interesting thing to keep in mind is when we talk about a vintage watch, right? So when this Rolex Hulk possibly goes vintage, the dial might start getting a little bit weathered. It might start looking a little bit aged, as some of the older Submariners do. But with this Seamaster, it's made of ceramic, so ceramics are typically more weather resistant. So metal is corrosive. It can corrode, it can erode. I'm not a scientist here, but from my understanding, different types of metal can really be weathered quite easily over time. Though, when we talk about ceramics, they don't really respond to different types of lights and certain types of heats and type of erosion. Now, this is not soil or rocks we're talking about. These are encased inside of metal stainless steel cases here, but nonetheless, light does play a factor, and Omega really drives home the fact that they've done something special with the dial when they talk about using that zirconium oxide ceramic to actually create the dial. Now, lastly, in terms of dial side, the Rolex has the date at the 3 o'clock. The Seamaster has the date at the 6 o'clock. There's no magnification on the Seamaster at the 6, and there is, of course, the typical Rolex Cyclops at the 3. So not necessarily one is better than the other, because there are Rolex models that don't have the Cyclops, but it's all personal preference. So depending on what you like and how you like it, you might like that Cyclops or you might not. Now, we need to talk about the overall impressions of the watch that I get, especially before we talk about price, which is the real conversation in the room, if I might say so myself. So let's set down this Seamaster and just kind of look at the Hulk and the overall impressions. When you first pick it up, you'll notice it has quite a weight to it. It feels like you have something in your hands. It features the maxi case, so with this maxi case, even though it's 40 millimeters, it wears much larger, primarily because of the way that these crown guards stick out, and also it's just a solid heavy case. Of course, this one has the bracelet, the Seamaster does not in terms of this specific video, though I will say that the Seamaster bracelet does add a bit of weight to it, but not quite as much as the Submariner. Now, when you look at it and you let the light bounce off of it, you see that there's a lot of shine, there's a lot of polished edges. The ceramic bezel just throws the light off of it directly at you, and it's a bit impressive. Part of it, of course, for those that are somewhat new to watch collecting, is just having the Rolex in your hands. Having a Rolex has meant something for the longest time, and I'm sure that adds a bit of bias to anyone doing this review, myself included. Though when you just look at this and you just turn it over, every single edge, even if it's brushed, just throws off the light in such a way that it just leaves an impression. I would compare it to kind of if you had a car and you took it to a car wash and they polished it for you, they shined it up, and when it comes out of the car wash, you look at it and you say, wow, like there's a bit of a feeling where you say, oh, that's very clean. And that's kind of something similar, I would say, that happens when you look at this Rolex Submariner. It just feels a bit luxurious. Now, I'll set this down and I'll talk about my impressions when picking up the Seamaster. So immediately when picking up the watch, you'll notice it's a bit lighter. Sure, it doesn't have the bracelet, but I can remember even when I held the ones that did have a bracelet, it just seems like a little bit lighter of a watch. Now, this specific watch, sure, it's a luxury watch, but I'll say that in my opinion, it's much more of a tool watch. In this lighting, it does give off a bit of shine, but when you look at it, not from underneath the lens of a camera, the edges just seem a little bit more brushed, a little less shiny, and I would say that it feels slightly less impressive, but only in the terms of luxury, because in my opinion, it is a very impressive watch. When you look at things like these lugs and the way that they have the mixture between brushing and polishing, it's really reminiscent of earlier days of Omega, especially in their Speedmasters, where you had these kind of curved lugs that have this certain profile where it's twisted. Now, when you consider something like the Hulk, the lugs are just honestly very straight and very contrasting between the sides and the top, whereas with the Seamaster, we have this sporty and sleek twist which really makes it feel very sporty. Go figure for a sports watch. Now, when I put this specific Seamaster on my wrist, I'll say that it wears very comfortably. Now, sure, it's 2 millimeters longer, so from lug to lug, the top lug to the bottom lug, it's 2 millimeters longer than the Submariner, though the way that these lugs kind of are and the way that they're kind of pushed down, it really allows it to sit on the wrist pretty good, especially for a smaller wrist size like myself at 6.5 inches. So when you look at this watch, my impression is just a sporty, cool, kind of a little bit avant-garde in terms of the dial. You have the waves. It's just a sports watch. You feel like you're holding a sports watch, like you want to jump in the water, splash around, or possibly go on a boat or go surfing or something like that. I literally do not do any of those things, but that's just the feeling that I feel when I'm holding this watch. It just kind of evokes this sporty, kind of agile feeling, whereas when I hold the Submariner, the Hulk, sure, it's a sports watch, it's supposed to be a tool watch, but it feels much more of a luxury item. Now, they're both luxury items, and they both come at certainly a price that is not necessarily approachable nor entry level, though the Rolex just comes off, in my opinion, as a bit more of a luxury item. It's heavier, it's shinier, and the Seamaster just comes across as more of a sporty thing, but I think that they both serve certainly a purpose, each in their own. The Seamaster, I'll say, comes at a much lower price tag than the Rolex Submariner Hulk. The Rolex Submariner Hulk comes at a price tag of a retail price of $8,550 US, though you will not find it, you will not get on a waiting list, and you will not buy it brand new. It's just unfortunately where the Rolex market is today. You will have to either wait around a long time or pay $15,000 roughly in the pre-owned or gray market to get yourself one of these Rolex Submariners. Now with the Seamaster, I'll say that the retail is about $5,200 US, so right out of the gate, the retail price is lower, and you can have these, particularly this model, for $3,599 US. So for the smallest fraction of the price of the Hulk, in my opinion, you can have a technically better sports watch, though it does not necessarily mean that that's the watch that you would like. You know, there's always things in the world that are a little bit better technically, but it just might not be the thing that you want. And that's what it comes down to a lot of times when we compare Rolex to other watches, particularly this Seamaster. The Rolex, sure, it's an excellent watch, though it does come at that price tag, and you are paying for the Rolex name. And Omega is building a rock-solid name to certainly rival Rolex, though they haven't reached that yet. And that's where I think you can get a lot of great value, because Rolex needs to put those extra functions, features, and certain quirks and impressiveness in the watch to get you on those levels, whereas Rolex can just play on the name and give you a good, solid product. So lastly, I just want to hold both of these up to the camera and just let you kind of look at them side by side, so that if you are in the market for one of these, you can kind of look at both of them and draw your own conclusions, because you will not be able to walk into any store and put a Hulk next to a Seamaster, let alone a Rolex sports watch next to a Seamaster. You just won't find it. So I'll do that for you here and quickly wrap up and then leave you on a high note. hope you found this video to be pretty interesting, right? It's kind of amazing that the Omega Seamaster in current times offers so much, especially at the price point. When we're talking about such a huge difference in terms of price, it's kind of a no-brainer, in my opinion, to squeeze into something like the Seamaster, especially if you're after more of a tool watch, as opposed to a luxury watch. But it goes without saying that Rolex watches also mean something else, a little bit different, but what we see in recent times is Omega is certainly shortening or decreasing that gap, which I really like to see because it shows that in 2019, in the watchmaking world, there are some brands that keep innovating, and I do appreciate that as a watch nut. Anyway, guys, you have been chatting with John P. Ciao.